An invincible army, a brilliant general, and the greatest massacre in Roman history. In 216 years before Christ, Hannibal carved his name in blood with a victory so brutal, so devastating, that it's still studied today as a masterpiece of warfare. But here's the mind-blowing question that haunts historians even now. How did one man, fighting on enemy soil and outnumbered almost 2-to-1, manage to annihilate 50,000 Romans in a single day? Think about that for a moment. We're talking about Rome at the height of its power, the empire that would eventually conquer most of the known world. Yet on that scorching August afternoon near the small town of Cannae, they suffered what many consider their most humiliating defeat ever. Hannibal wasn't just any general. This was the man who had crossed the Alps with elephants, who had already handed Rome several crushing defeats, and who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to read his enemies' minds. But the Romans, they had something Hannibal didn't. Numbers, lots of them. 86,000 soldiers, the largest army Rome had ever assembled. Surely they thought sheer force would be enough. They were dead wrong, literally. But here's what really gets me about this story. And it's a question that keeps me up at night. What drives an empire to abandon its own winning strategy and march straight into a bloodbath? Was it pride? The unbearable pressure from citizens who were tired of watching their farms burn while their armies played it safe? Or was it that dangerous illusion that numbers always triumph over strategy? You see, Rome had actually found a way to deal with Hannibal. A brilliant dictator named Quintus Fabius Maximus had developed what we now call the Fabian strategy. Basically, avoid direct confrontation, harass the enemy, cut off their supplies, and wait for them to make a mistake. It was working. Hannibal was stuck, frustrated, running out of options. But Rome got impatient. The people were furious. Their fields were being ravaged, their pride was wounded, and they demanded action. So they did what seemed logical. They gathered the biggest army in their history and decided to crush this upstart Carthaginian once and for all. What happened next wasn't just a battle. It was a masterclass in military psychology and tactical genius that still makes generals around the world break out in cold sweats. If you want to understand how Hannibal pulled off the impossible, how he turned Rome's greatest strength into its fatal weakness, and why this single day in 216 before Christ changed the course of history forever, then stick with me until the very end. Trust me, this story will blow your mind. If you're loving this deep dive into history's most epic moments, make sure to hit that like button, share this with anyone who appreciates incredible true stories, and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles. We're here to bring you the greatest epics from the ancient world, told the way they deserve to be told, with all the drama, strategy, and human emotion that made them legendary. Now, let me tell you about one of the most fascinating psychological battles in military history. And it happened before the first sword was even drawn. Picture Rome in the summer of 216 before Christ. For 6 long, agonizing months, the city had been following the strategy of Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man so famous for his patience that history remembers him as Cunctator, literally the delayer. And you know what? It was working brilliantly. Fabius had figured out something that would take military strategists centuries to fully appreciate. Sometimes the best way to win is not to fight. Instead of giving Hannibal the pitched battle he wanted, Fabius kept his distance, harassed Carthaginian supply lines, and basically played the ancient equivalent of a chess match where he refused to take the bait. But here's where human nature becomes the enemy of good strategy. The Roman people were absolutely furious. Picture this. You're a Roman farmer, and every day you watch smoke rising from where your fields used to be. Your livestock is gone, your crops are destroyed, and your own army, the mighty Roman legions, are essentially running away from a foreign invader. How would you feel? The streets of Rome were buzzing with anger. People were demanding action. They called Fabius a coward, whispered that he was afraid to fight, and some even suggested he might be secretly working with Hannibal. It was political suicide to continue the delaying strategy, even though it was the smartest thing Rome could do. And this is where our story gets really interesting, because Rome decided to put 2 men in charge of the largest army they had ever assembled. 86,000 soldiers, more troops than many countries have today. But here's the twist. These two consuls couldn't have been more different if they'd tried. First, you had Gaius Terentius Varro, and this guy was everything the angry Roman mob wanted in a leader. He was aggressive, impulsive, and absolutely convinced that Roman courage and superior numbers would crush any enemy. Varro was the kind of general who believed that attack was always the best defense, and he had the political backing of the common people who were sick and tired of Fabius's cautious approach. Then there was Lucius Aemilius Paullus, a seasoned, careful commander who had actually studied Hannibal's previous victories and understood just how dangerous this Carthaginian really was. Paullus wanted to continue Fabius's strategy, or at least proceed with extreme caution. He knew that Hannibal was laying a trap somewhere, somehow. Now, here's a detail that makes this whole story even more tragic. Roman tradition dictated that these two consuls would alternate command of the army every single day. Can you imagine trying to run a military campaign when your strategy changes every 24 hours? It's like having two drivers who keep grabbing the steering wheel while you're speeding toward a cliff. The Romans had literally abandoned the one strategy that was saving them, seduced by the promise of a quick, glorious victory. They convinced themselves that their massive numerical advantage, almost 2-to-1, would be enough to overwhelm Hannibal's smaller force. And Hannibal? He was counting on exactly this kind of thinking. This master tactician had spent months studying Roman psychology, and he knew that patience was not Rome's strong suit. He had been deliberately provoking them, raiding their territories, making sure the pressure on Roman leadership became unbearable. The tragic irony is breathtaking when you think about it. Rome possessed the perfect strategy to defeat Hannibal, but they threw it away because it didn't feel heroic enough. They chose the path that looked like strength, but was actually walking straight into the most devastating trap in military history. Now let me tell you about the man who was about to orchestrate one of the most brilliant military deceptions in human history. While Rome was gathering its massive army and arguing about strategy, Hannibal Barca was doing something far more dangerous than just preparing for battle, he was thinking. And when Hannibal thought, empires trembled. Picture this. While the Romans had 86,000 soldiers marching toward him, Hannibal commanded roughly 50,000 men. Now, in any normal calculation, those numbers should have terrified him. But here's what made Hannibal absolutely extraordinary. He didn't see numbers, he saw opportunity. His army was unlike anything Rome had ever faced. Sure, he had those legendary war elephants that had survived the horrific Alpine crossing, massive beasts that could trample through enemy lines and spread absolute terror. But Hannibal's real secret weapon wasn't his elephants. It was the incredible diversity of his forces. Think about it. He had fierce Gallic warriors from what we now call France, men who fought with a berserker-like fury and had personal grudges against Rome. He had Spanish Iberians, masters of guerrilla warfare who could move like shadows and strike like lightning. He had North African cavalry that could outmaneuver any Roman horseman, and Carthaginian infantry trained in tactics that Rome had never encountered. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. Hannibal had managed to keep this incredibly diverse army together for years, fighting in enemy territory with no reliable supply lines from home. These weren't just soldiers. They were survivors who had followed this man across the Alps through countless battles, and they trusted him with their lives. And Hannibal? He had been studying the Romans like a scientist studies lab rats. He knew exactly how they thought, how they fought, and most importantly, how their pride would be their downfall. His plan was so audacious it bordered on insanity, and that's precisely why it was brilliant. While the Roman consuls were probably losing sleep over how to arrange their massive formation, Hannibal was crafting a psychological masterpiece. He wanted the Romans to attack. In fact, he was counting on their arrogance. You see, Hannibal understood something about human nature that most generals miss. When people think they have an overwhelming advantage, they become predictable. He knew that when those Roman legions saw his smaller army, they would do exactly what Romans always did, charge straight at the center with all the subtlety of a battering ram. So here's what this genius did. He deliberately weakened his center, placing his least experienced troops there. Gallic warriors who were brave but not as disciplined as his veterans. Then he positioned his absolute best forces, his most experienced and deadly fighters, on the wings of his formation. Now, here's a detail that gives me chills every time I think about it. While the Roman commanders would be safely positioned in the rear, directing the battle from a distance like chess masters moving pieces, Hannibal did something completely different. This man, this brilliant strategist who held the fate of Carthage in his hands, grabbed his sword and marched to the front lines. That's right. Hannibal fought shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers. Can you imagine the psychological impact? Here's your commander, the man who crossed the Alps, who defeated Rome time and again, standing right next to you in the mud and blood, sharing the same dangers you face. But this wasn't just about inspiring his troops, though it certainly did that. Hannibal positioned himself at the center of his formation because that's where his plan would succeed or fail. He needed to personally control the retreat of his center, making sure it bent but didn't break, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into his trap. While Roman soldiers were looking for their commanders in the rear, Carthaginian warriors could see Hannibal right there with them, his armor gleaming, his voice cutting through the chaos of battle. The man was literally conducting a symphony of destruction from the front row. And here's perhaps the most chilling part. Hannibal had already seen this battle play out in his mind. He had visualized every phase, anticipated every Roman move, and prepared for every contingency. While the Romans were relying on their superior numbers and traditional tactics, Hannibal was about to turn their greatest strength into their fatal weakness. He wasn't just fighting a battle. He was setting the perfect trap, and the Romans were about to walk right into it. And now, my friends, we come to the moment that would be studied in military academies for the next 2,000 years. The moment when Hannibal's genius turned 86,000 Roman soldiers into victims of the most perfect military trap ever conceived. Picture the battlefield on that sweltering August morning. The sun was already beating down mercilessly on the dusty plains near Cannae, and you could probably feel the tension in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The Roman legions were arranged in their traditional formation, a massive, intimidating rectangle of shields, spears, and Roman steel that had conquered most of the Mediterranean world. But Hannibal, he had arranged his forces in something completely different. Instead of a traditional battle line, he positioned his army in a crescent shape, almost like a bow that was slightly bent backward. And here's the brilliant part. He deliberately made his center look weak. Think about this for a second. Hannibal placed his least experienced troops, those fierce but undisciplined Gallic warriors, right in the middle where the Romans would naturally focus their attack. To any Roman commander looking across that field, it must have seemed like a gift from the gods. The enemy's weakest point was right there, practically begging to be crushed. And the Romans took the bait exactly as Hannibal knew they would. When the battle began, those 86,000 legionaries did what Romans always did. They charged straight at the center with devastating force. The Gallic warriors in Hannibal's center began to give ground, falling back step by step under the relentless Roman pressure. But here's what the Romans couldn't see. This retreat was perfectly controlled. Hannibal was right there in the thick of it, personally managing every step backward, making sure his center bent but never broke. It was like watching a master archer draw back a bowstring. The more pressure the Romans applied, the more dangerous Hannibal's position became. As the Roman legions pushed deeper into Hannibal's center, something incredible was happening on the flanks. Those veteran Carthaginian forces that Hannibal had positioned on his wings, his best cavalry, his most experienced infantry, his deadliest fighters, they weren't retreating at all. Instead, they were moving. Like the jaws of some enormous predator, Hannibal's flanks began to close around the advancing Romans. The Carthaginian cavalry swept around behind the Roman army, cutting off any possibility of retreat. The veteran infantry on the wings wheeled inward, trapping the legions in a deadly embrace. And suddenly, in a moment that must have felt like a nightmare becoming real, the Romans realized what was happening. They weren't winning. They were being surrounded. What happened next was so horrifying that Roman historians would struggle to describe it for generations. Imagine 86,000 men suddenly compressed into a space meant for maybe 20,000. The Romans found themselves pressed together so tightly that they couldn't even lift their weapons. Swords became useless. Shields couldn't be raised. Spears couldn't be thrust. They were being crushed by their own numbers. In that deadly circle, Roman legionaries began dying not just from Carthaginian weapons, but from exhaustion, dehydration, and suffocation. Picture this. You're a Roman soldier, packed so tightly against your comrades that you can barely breathe. The Mediterranean sun is beating down mercilessly. You're wearing heavy armor, and you haven't had water in hours. Men around you are collapsing from heat stroke, and there's nowhere to fall because there's no space. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians were methodically working their way through the outer edges of this human mass, cutting down Romans who couldn't defend themselves. It wasn't even a battle anymore. It was systematic slaughter. And through it all, Hannibal's tactical masterpiece was playing out exactly as he had envisioned. He had turned Rome's greatest strength, their massive numbers, into their fatal weakness. Those 86,000 soldiers who were supposed to guarantee victory had become 86,000 trapped victims. Now, here's a detail that will absolutely blow your mind and shows you just how coldly calculating Hannibal could be. After the massacre was over, he ordered his men to collect the gold rings from the fingers of dead Roman knights, the equites, Rome's elite cavalry class. These rings were symbols of noble status, worn by Rome's aristocracy. Hannibal filled 3 whole liters with these golden rings, 3 liters, and sent them back to Carthage as proof of his victory. Can you imagine the psychological impact when those rings arrived in the Carthaginian Senate? It wasn't just evidence of a military victory, it was proof that Hannibal had wiped out an entire generation of Roman nobility in a single afternoon. If you're finding this story as incredible as I do, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. If you had been in Rome's position, would you have stuck with Fabius Maximus's patient strategy, or would you have taken the risk like Varro did? Because honestly, knowing what we know now, it's easy to judge. But imagine being there, with your people demanding action and your pride on the line. When the dust finally settled on that blood-soaked field near Cannae, the numbers were so staggering that even Hannibal's own officers could barely believe what they had accomplished. 70,000 Romans lay dead. 70,000, including Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the very man who had warned against this disastrous confrontation. To put that in perspective, this wasn't just a military defeat. This was demographic catastrophe. Rome had just lost an entire generation of fighting men in a single afternoon. We're talking about the worst military disaster in Roman history up to that point. Worse than anything they had suffered during their wars with the Gauls. Worse than their conflicts with the Samnites. Worse than anything in their collective memory. But here's what makes this tragedy even more heartbreaking. Among those 70,000 dead were not just ordinary soldiers, but the cream of Roman society. Remember those gold rings that Hannibal collected? Each one represented a Roman knight, a member of the aristocracy, someone's son from one of Rome's most prominent families. Entire bloodlines were wiped out in those few horrific hours. When the news reached Rome, the city went into a state of shock that's almost impossible to imagine. Picture this. Runners arriving with reports so devastating that senators literally couldn't process what they were hearing. The largest army in Roman history, gone. Their bravest consul, dead. Tens of thousands of their finest warriors, slaughtered like sheep in a pen. But here's where Roman psychology becomes absolutely fascinating, because the government's response reveals just how terrified they truly were. The Senate made a decision that seems almost surreal when you think about it. They banned public mourning. That's right. They literally made it illegal for people to grieve in public. Women were forbidden from crying in the streets, families couldn't hold traditional funeral ceremonies, and any display of sorrow was seen as potentially damaging to public morale. Can you imagine living through that? Your son, your husband, your father might be dead on a battlefield hundreds of miles away, and you're not even allowed to cry about it. The reasoning was terrifyingly practical. Rome was genuinely afraid that if people saw the true scale of their grief, the city would descend into panic. They were worried about mass hysteria, about people fleeing the city, about their allies abandoning them when they realized how vulnerable Rome had become. And they had good reason to be scared. News of Cannae spread across the Mediterranean like wildfire, and suddenly, every enemy Rome had ever made was paying attention. City-states that had been forced into Roman alliances began to waver. Some of Rome's oldest enemies started making plans. But now comes one of the most chilling examples of psychological warfare in ancient history, and it shows you just how deeply Hannibal understood the Roman mind. After the battle, Hannibal made a decision that seems merciful on the surface, but was actually calculated cruelty. He spared 10,000 Roman prisoners, 10,000 broken, wounded, traumatized survivors of the massacre. Now, you might think this was an act of mercy, but Hannibal was far too clever for simple compassion. Here's what this master strategist understood. Dead soldiers are a tragedy, but they're also a closed chapter. Wounded, traumatized survivors, they're a living nightmare that never ends. Those 10,000 prisoners weren't just men. They were walking advertisements for Hannibal's power. When they eventually returned to Rome through prisoner exchanges or ransoms, they carried with them not just physical wounds, but psychological scars that would never heal. They had stories to tell about the massacre, about watching their comrades die, about seeing the entire Roman war machine crumble in a single day. But Hannibal's calculation went even deeper than psychological trauma. Those 10,000 wounded prisoners would require medical care, food, housing, and support from Roman families and the Roman state. Instead of being productive citizens contributing to Rome's recovery, they became a massive drain on resources at the exact moment when Rome could least afford it. It was demographic warfare at its most sophisticated. Hannibal understood that sometimes the most devastating blow you can deliver to an enemy isn't killing their soldiers. It's sending them home broken, creating a constant reminder of defeat that saps the strength and morale of an entire civilization. And perhaps most brilliantly of all, those 10,000 survivors became living proof of Roman vulnerability. Every time someone in Rome saw a Cannae veteran limping through the streets, they were reminded that their supposedly invincible legions could be destroyed, that their greatest generals could be outmaneuvered, and that even Rome itself might not be safe from this Carthaginian genius who seemed to anticipate their every move. Now here's what absolutely blows my mind about this story. 2,000 years later, military commanders around the world are still studying what Hannibal did on that bloody field near Cannae. And I mean literally still studying it. As in, right now, at this very moment, there are cadets at West Point, Sandhurst, and military academies across the globe analyzing every detail of Hannibal's double envelopment. Think about that for a second. We live in an age of drone warfare, satellite intelligence, and precision-guided missiles, yet military strategists are still obsessing over a battle fought with swords and spears in 216 before Christ. Why? Because Hannibal didn't just win a battle. He revealed eternal truths about warfare that transcend technology. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered most of Europe, was absolutely fascinated by Cannae. He studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively, calling him the most audacious of all generals. Napoleon understood something that many commanders miss. Superior numbers mean nothing if you don't know how to use them. In fact, as Cannae proved, massive armies can become their own worst enemy if they're poorly deployed. But it gets even more incredible. During World War I, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, the German general who designed Germany's master plan for conquering Europe, based his entire strategy on what Hannibal had accomplished at Cannae. The Schlieffen plan was essentially an attempt to recreate Hannibal's double envelopment on a continental scale, sweep around through Belgium, encircle the French armies, and end the war in 6 weeks. Now, the Schlieffen plan ultimately failed, but the fact that a modern European power would stake everything on a tactical concept from ancient Carthage tells you everything you need to know about Hannibal's genius. Military thinkers separated by 2 millennia were looking to the same battle for inspiration because it demonstrated something fundamental about the nature of warfare itself. And what is that fundamental truth? It's this: battles aren't won by whoever has the most soldiers, the biggest weapons, or the heaviest armor. Battles are won by whoever better understands logistics, psychology, and the element of surprise. Hannibal proved that you can defeat a numerically superior enemy if you understand their weaknesses better than they understand your strengths. He showed that psychological warfare can be more devastating than physical force, and that the most powerful weapon in any commander's arsenal is the ability to think several moves ahead of their opponent. But here's perhaps the most fascinating part of Cannae's legacy, and it reveals something profound about how people learn from trauma. Rome absorbed this lesson so completely, so painfully, that it fundamentally changed how they approached warfare for the rest of their history. After Cannae, Rome never again underestimated Hannibal. But, and this is crucial, they also never again gave him the opportunity to demonstrate his tactical brilliance. They went back to Fabius Maximus's strategy of avoidance, harassment, and attrition. They would shadow Hannibal's army, cut off his supplies, attack his allies, and gradually strangle his campaign, but they would never ever give him another chance to spring a trap like Cannae. It's actually kind of tragic when you think about it. Rome had learned their lesson so well that they essentially admitted they couldn't beat Hannibal in a fair fight. The empire that would eventually conquer the entire Mediterranean was so scarred by this one battle that they spent the next decade running away from the man who had defeated them. And you know what? It worked. Hannibal spent the rest of his time in Italy winning small skirmishes, but never getting the decisive victory he needed to actually defeat Rome. His tactical genius became irrelevant because Rome refused to give him the kind of battle where that genius could shine. This is why military historians call Cannae both Hannibal's greatest triumph and, in a strange way, his ultimate defeat. He had created a tactical masterpiece so perfect that his enemies simply stopped playing the game he was best at. Today, every military academy in the world teaches the Battle of Cannae as the ultimate example of tactical envelopment. It's studied not just as history, but as a living blueprint for how superior strategy can overcome superior numbers. Modern generals learn about Hannibal's crescent formation, his psychological manipulation of enemy commanders, and his ability to turn an opponent's strength into their weakness. But perhaps most importantly, they learn the deeper lesson that Cannae teaches, that in warfare, as in life, intelligence and adaptability will always triumph over brute force and rigid thinking. Hannibal didn't just defeat an army at Cannae, he demonstrated that the human mind, when properly applied, is the most powerful weapon ever created. And here we are, at the end of one of history's most devastating lessons. The Battle of Cannae teaches us something profound that echoes through the centuries. Victory isn't just about brute force or having the biggest army. It's about understanding your enemy better than they understand themselves. Think about it for a moment. Rome had everything going for them that day in 216 before Christ. They had the numbers, nearly twice as many soldiers as Hannibal. They had the home advantage, fighting on Italian soil. They had the resources of the most powerful republic in the Mediterranean. Yet they walked straight into a trap that would be studied by military commanders for the next 2,000 years. What happened? Rome fell into their own snare. They believed that raw power could overcome strategy. They thought that 86,000 legionaries could simply bulldoze through 50,000 Carthaginians by sheer force of will and numbers. But Hannibal knew the Romans better than they knew themselves. He understood their pride, their impatience, their need for decisive action, and he used every single one of those traits against them. The irony is almost poetic. Rome abandoned the very strategy that had been working, Fabius Maximus's careful, patient approach. Instead, they chose the path that seemed obvious, the path that appealed to their emotions rather than their wisdom. And in doing so, they turned their greatest strength into their greatest weakness. This makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many times in our own lives do we make the same mistake? How often do we underestimate a challenge because we're too confident in the obvious solution? How many times do we ignore the subtle approach because we're seduced by the promise of quick, decisive action? Hannibal's genius wasn't just in his tactics on that bloody August day. It was in his psychological understanding of his opponents. He knew that if he gave the Romans what they thought they wanted, a direct confrontation, he could manipulate the entire battle to his advantage. He turned their aggression into a weapon against themselves. And here's something fascinating that most people don't realize. After Cannae, Rome never again faced Hannibal in open battle. They learned their lesson the hard way, but they learned it completely. The empire that would eventually conquer the Mediterranean world was forged in the crucible of that terrible defeat. The ghosts of Cannae still whisper to us today. In boardrooms and battlefields, in sports arenas and negotiation tables, the same principle applies. The one who truly understands the game, who sees beyond the surface, who thinks 3 moves ahead, that's the one who usually wins, regardless of size or apparent strength. So, as we close this chapter of ancient warfare, ask yourself this question. In your own battles, your own challenges, are you being the Romans or are you being Hannibal? Are you relying on brute force and obvious solutions, or are you taking the time to truly understand what you're up against? If this dive into history has surprised you, if it's made you think differently about strategy and human nature, then do me a favor. Hit that like button to let me know this resonated with you. Share this video with anyone who loves strategy, history, or just great storytelling. And don't forget to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles, because we're just getting started on our journey through history's most legendary battles and the lessons they still teach us today. The next epic battle awaits, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, remember Cannae, remember its lessons, and never underestimate the power of truly understanding your opponent. See you in the next historical adventure.